Some of you are like, wait a minute, I don't know. Here this preacher goes talking about being rich and all that kind of stuff. I do want you to pick up your copy of How to Be Rich. And guess what? We're giving every family a copy when you leave out tonight. So make sure you stop by the table and get your free book. We want one per family or one per household. Take this book. And listen, if you read one chapter a week, you could finish this book, you and your spouse, in studying it, could finish this book by the time our series comes through. I'm going to tell you, once you get into it, you're going to finish it a lot sooner than that. But that book's out there, and much of my message tonight and in the coming weeks will come from the book. It's not exactly what you think just from the title of it. You know, as my uncle often jokes about his childhood, growing up we were poor, we were proud. And I borrow stories from him, you know, following his lead. I joke about the Christmas that we got the piece of chewing gum, and then my brother and I had to take turns chewing it throughout the year. I joke about the time that the mule died, so Mama strapped us to the plow, and we had to take care of the plow that year. But, you know, there are some real stories. There's some true stories. Like I remember growing up, and on Sunday nights, on certain special Sunday nights, when the Whopper at Burger King was 99 cents. How many of you remember what 99-cent Whopper was? On those special nights, we'd go through the drive-thru and we would get 3 Whoppers and 2 fries. My dad would get a Whopper, my mom would get half, the 3 siblings would get half, and then we'd all split the fries. And that was a special treat. You know, I think about things like that, and you know, the truth of the matter is, yeah, we had hand-me-downs. We really didn't eat out a whole lot. You know, we didn't keep up with the Joneses by any means. But you know what? We never went without. I never went hungry. You know, I never knew I was poor if I was poor. But my aunt and uncle from a city far, far away in a place called Chattanooga, they were rich. See, they lived in a 2-story house. And I remember the first time they took our family to this really upscale restaurant in Savannah called Applebee's. And they served ribs. And we just thought that this was the greatest thing ever because they were rich and we weren't. It really is a matter of perspective though, isn't it? Because how many of you went out to eat at a place like Applebee's 3 times this week? But I certainly don't consider myself rich. I don't feel rich. Probably you're saying, yeah, that's not me. I'm not rich. But, you know, we do all of those things and we don't consider ourselves rich. But are we poor? You know, even I have to say, poor is not us. Poor is the people in Costa Rica, Mexico, where I've been on missions trips, where they literally live in the trash dump. They take trash and garbage and build houses. Those are poor people, but we're not rich. Well, in his book, How to Be Rich, Andy Stanley talks about this very thing, about being rich. He says this, he says, growing up, we always had enough, but rich is about having more than enough. The problem is that rich is a moving target. No matter how much money we have or make, we will probably never consider ourselves rich. Think about that. As we launch into this new series, we're going to find something that financial matters, things like being rich or being in debt or how we handle money. These things really are about our perspectives. They're about our attitudes. They're about our mindset and our heart as much or more than they are about our actual behaviors, the things that we do. So more fundamental than behaviors, things like how we spend our money, or how do I get out of debt, or how do I spend my money, or how do I save or invest for retirement. Those things, those behaviors, the things that we do, we'll talk about those some in the coming weeks. But even more basic than that, it has to do with how you think about money, how you handle money. Luke 12:34, Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart, or the desires of your heart will also be. So before we deal with the behaviors, we've got to address our thinking as an outflow of our heart. And I want you to get this picture as we start talking about scriptures. And I've said it before that in the Bible, it's not about simply head knowledge, but it's the integration of what we know in our head and what we know or think in our heart, out of our being and out of our passions. Proverbs 23:7 says, as a person thinks in his heart, so is he or so is she. And we say, well, wait a minute, I don't think with my heart. But the Bible, in terms of the Bible, how we think has to do with who we are as a product of our heart condition. So we're going to deal with some of those very practical steps to change or at least improve our financial situation. And we're going to provide some resources, and we're going to work together, things like some books and some handouts and some other things that we're going to do to make sure that Cop Church families are on the top of Money Matters. So make sure you grab your book out there. And I just do want to point out that in the next few weeks, and we may have a guest speaker, so I don't know, but nothing new is under the sun, so I'm not the genius of all of this, and I haven't mastered all of this. I'm working on it myself. But I want to credit the sources. I want to credit sources like obviously God's Word. There are things like Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace some of you may have gone through, or Crown Financial. If you're like me, you've been through both of them and still hadn't quite got it all right. There's other pastors, and there's one in particular, there's a pastor in Florida that taught his congregation, and some of his points, I feel like he deals with this topic, and especially the text we're going to cover tonight, so just perfectly that I wanted to borrow some of that. So I want to make sure that I always give credit where credit is due, but I think we're going to learn from it and pray that God works in our hearts. So let's dive right in tonight to financial first aid for first responders. And the first message tonight is the heart of the matter, because we have to deal with the heart. So I want you to turn in your Bibles or turn on your cell phones, your PDAs, things like that. Luke chapter 12. If you have the choice, I like to read from the New Living Translation. It's I find that it has a lot of integrity, but it also is very much in modern day language. And I often refer to New American Standard, King James, some of those other versions. But Luke chapter 12, beginning in verse 13, says, "Then someone called from the crowd, 'Teacher, please tell my brother to divide our father's estate with me.' And Jesus replied, 'Friend, who made me a judge over you to decide such things as that?'" How many of you know families can get along until a death in the family, and all of a sudden we got to decide who gets mama's what? Then he said, "Beware, guard your heart against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." Then, verse 16, he told them a story, a parable to illustrate his point. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops. The New American Standard says the land was very productive. The King James Version says the ground yielded an abundance. And that's important. Verse 17, he said to himself, "What should I do? I don't have room for all my crops." Then he said, "I know, I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. Then I'll have room enough to store all of my wheat and other goods. And I'll sit back and I'll say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, you will die this very night. Then who will get everything that you worked for? Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God." That's a powerful thought there. And so as we look at this text, I want to just share with you briefly for the next few moments 3 perspectives related to money matters that most commonly need adjustment in our hearts. Things that we see in this passage that we deal with that we really need to get a clear view of, a clear perspective. The first perspective is the perspective that says, I earned it. Look at verse 16 and the first part of 17. "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. So he said, 'What should I do?'" Now think about this. The first thing to point out is Jesus called him rich. Says a certain rich man because his harvest was abundant. In other words, he had more than he needed, so he was rich. And so the question really comes about, what do we want? What do we need? Andy Stanley says, there's something about living in a civilized, industrialized culture that compromises rational thought. The richer you get, the more your priorities begin to separate from your actual needs. We simply turn from the things we need to the things we want. And that's when we enter the world of subjective. Wants are harder to define and easier to confuse. The ground was fertile, and the man took credit for its harvest. Think about it. God created the ground. He created the land. 2 Corinthians 9:10 says He gives the seed to the sower. He sends the rain, and yet the man took credit for what God had done. Do you see it in his perspective? He said, I did that, so now what else should I do? You get it? Because of the fact he's asking, what should I do, is to imply that I did that, I earned it, I worked hard. Now listen to me, you'll hear this. Yes, we work hard. We want to put in effort. We have to value work ethic, but we have to understand there are a lot of people around this world that work very hard, just as hard or harder than we do. There are some people that actually have to work 7 days to live 7 days, not 5 days, 40 hours to live 7 days. There are some people that don't have one wage earner in their house to work 5 days so that 4 people can live 7 days. You see that? Jesus says if you have more than you need, you're a certain rich man. And so we begin to see these perspectives. We talk about things like Western culture and first world problems. We were born or live in the most blessed nation in all of the world's history. Most of our problems are still luxuries around the world. Now this is hard stuff to swallow, but the whole point that Andy Stanley starts out with is we have to recognize that we are rich. The problem is we don't know how to be rich. We don't know how to live like we're rich because we don't think it, because we're shooting at a moving target and because our perspectives are skewed. But the truth of the matter is we are rich. We have to recognize we're rich. So then how do we learn to be rich? The problem is a lot of times we think, I've earned it. And the truth of the matter is the starting salary in our agencies automatically puts us within the top 4 to 5% of wage earners in the world. 48,000, top 1%. 37,000, top 4%. You look at about 31 to 32,000, we're right there in automatically the top 4 to 5% in the world. I can hear some of you right now making excuses because I objected to them as well. Yeah, but the cost of living here is this, and you have to consider the expense to drive from work and blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. Listen, you get to go home and flush your toilet paper down the toilet. That sounds crude, but guess what? Your first lesson of the day when you go to just about any other country around this world is, don't flush the TP. We have fresh drinking water on tap 24 hours a day. We didn't have to plan our church service based on the 3 hours a day that we have electricity, because electricity is 24 hours a day. We're not going hungry. We have access to health care. We can argue about that all day long. The fact of the matter is if you get sick, you're going down the street and you're getting the care you need now. We're blessed. We're rich. So what's the proper perspective? If the man's perspective is, I did this, now what should I do? I've earned it. What is the proper perspective? The proper perspective is, I've been blessed with it. The idea is not to feel guilty. It's not to realize, to feel like we'll beat ourselves up. No, realize that we're blessed. God has blessed us. He's put His blessing upon our lives. So, whereas the I earned it mentality leads us to a sense of entitlement. It's mine because I earned it and this is what I'll do and this is what I'll do. And it leads to entitlement. The proper perspective says, I've been blessed with it, which then leads to gratitude. As Stanley goes on to say, he says, great things flow from a heart of gratitude. How many of you heard people say the problem with kids these days is they just don't appreciate? Heard those types of things? I think a lot of times as Americans, we just don't appreciate. So the first heart matter that we have to get right is that we work hard, but God has blessed us. He blesses our labor. He blesses the fruit of our hands. He blesses our nation. He has blessed us. And so we should be grateful and thankful to Him. So what's the second perspective? Look at verse 17. He says, I have no place to store my crops. The second perspective is, I own it. See, the first one is, I earned it. This one is, I own it. This passage is sometimes used to teach on saving. Say, well, he was planning ahead. He was saving. He built his storehouses and he was filling the storehouses. And this is just learning to invest for your future. And that's how people use it. Well, we should plan ahead. We should save. And we should also trust God and not allow our hope to migrate towards our income or our savings, our retirement, our investments, because that's what happens whether we realize it or not. And that's one of the things that Stanley talks about in his book is when we're used to having more than enough, eventually our hope migrates to what we do, what we have, what we own, our money, our savings account, until the economy collapses or until you get diagnosed with an incurable disease, until something happens that puts us on our knees and we realize, Psalm 24:1 says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. For He has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the floods. That the world is God's and everything in it. The earth, the people who live here, all God's. 100% God's, 0% mine. That's the truth of the matter. You see, we could say, well, he's thinking about those things. The truth of the matter is there's no amount of money that can protect us from everything. And his attitude in verse 19 and Jesus' response in verse 20 tells us that the man wanted to store or to save because he was greedy. That's why Jesus came back and basically lashed him for what he had done. Stanley in his book defines greed as the assumption that everything we have is for our consumption. Did you get that? Greed is simply, the selfish attitude of greed is simply assuming that everything God blesses us with is for our use. That every dollar on our paycheck, everything we get is for us to use, for our family to use, for our own personal consumption. Look at verse 19. He says, I'll sit back and say to myself, my friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Now take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Well, if greed and I own it, the mine. Y'all got kids? How many of you heard the problem of mine? If the improper skewed perspective is I own it, what is the proper biblical perspective related to finances? The proper perspective is I manage it. And there's a word called steward or stewardship, which basically means that we've been entrusted with or as managers of what is God's. He's allowed us to use it. And I got news for you. One thing that I've had to pray because, we talk about kids getting sick and all of these different things. And one of the things I've had to remind myself is, look, God, Olivia is not my daughter. She's your daughter. You loaned her to me. I hope she stays healthy. I pray for her health. I pray for her well-being. But I know that before anything else, she's your daughter and you know what's perfectly in her care and order and what to do about it. So not our children we don't own. None of it. It's God's, but He has so graciously entrusted us with the care of it. Well, he uses an illustration in the book. He talks about how the great, the Louvre in France, that's what the museum is called. It has all these pieces of artwork. They sent pieces of art to the Atlanta Museum for display. They weren't giving them to them. They were loaning them to display so other people could have the enjoyment and the benefit of experiencing them who might not otherwise be able to go to France. Now listen, even in the church, we talk about pay your tithes. 10%. Okay, I'll give God my 10%, and I'll keep the other 90%. And the truth of the matter is we never really give God anything. We think, well, we give God 10% and the other 90% is ours to do whatever we want to do. And that's if we give 10% and we think we're being awfully generous. But think about this. What if the Atlanta Museum said, we'll take care of 1/10 of this painting and keep it clean or keep it in order. We'll take care of 1/10 of the paintings they've given us, but the rest we'll treat however we want. We'll do what we want because those are ours. That doesn't make much sense. It wouldn't happen. There'd probably be another French Revolution or something going on if we had. They're on loan to us, so we take care of all of it properly. 100% is God's, so we need to care for 100% of it carefully as good stewards. God wants us to be faithful as managers of the things He's given us and into our care. So we give a portion back to Him. Why do we give that portion back to Him? We give it back to honor Him. We give it back to demonstrate our thanks or our gratitude, to say, God, thank you so much for what you've blessed us with. Now here's a portion back. We do it to remind ourselves that it's all His anyway. I hear my family members talk about, listen, you can live better off of that 90% with God's blessings than you could live off of 100 or 110%. And that's the truth. I'd rather have the part that I keep blessed than have all of it and be trying to scramble and figure out. And it's counterintuitive to us because we say, I don't have enough money left in my paycheck. I can't give anymore. I'm all out of bills. And so what we do is we wait for everything to dry up, and then we come and see what crumbs we have left to determine whether or not we can give anything to God. And it should be the exact opposite. God, thank you first and foremost for what you've given me. Now let me honor you by giving back. And then it opens up the door for Him to bless the rest. And so then you begin to see things happen. And I'll be sharing some stories in the coming weeks about it. But stewardship, what are the characteristics of good stewards? They practice accountability to God and others, taking care to do God's will and not be frivolous or wasteful. So first of all, when we realize that everything we've been blessed with, all of our time, all of our talent, all of our resources, all of our money, our paycheck is God's, then we'll be accountable for what we do with it. They also practice responsibility, taking care of what they are entrusted with. And thirdly, they practice generosity, blessing others as they have been blessed. You know, I quoted a few weeks ago during the offering, E.V. Hill, he says, if God can get it through you, He doesn't mind getting it to you. To understand that what God blesses us with is not all for our own consumption, but it's so He can get it through us to accomplish His mission in the world so that other people can be blessed as we are blessed. The I own it perspective leads to selfishness, but the I manage it perspective leads to faithfulness. And what's the third perspective? What's the third heart adjustment? The first one is understanding that we didn't necessarily earn it. We've been blessed with it. Secondly, not that we own it, but that we manage it for God. The third perspective is I crave it, or I need more. Look at verse 18. Basically what he's saying there is, I need bigger barns so I can store more and more and more. Now he says, so I can stop and I can retire and I can enjoy life. But obviously that's not what he meant, and Jesus knew that, and that's why Jesus came back to him. And besides that, he says, look, your heart is wrong anyway. Yes, you need to have a portion. You need to prepare. Proverbs talks about the ant who goes out and prepares for the, from the harvest and prepares for the winter. But we need to prepare. But he said, look, you're going to die tonight. And then what does all of this matter? You ought to be rich with God first. So again, we see the subjective nature of wealth, the moving target of being rich, the myth that we will always be satisfied if I can just get a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Guys quoted as saying, wealth is like seawater, salt water. The more we drink, the thirstier we become. We develop that insatiable appetite for more, for newer, for better. I was really hit home. I don't really upgrade my cell phones very much. That's why I have still an iPhone 4 for 8 gigabyte because I just don't upgrade. I'm always the last to upgrade stuff. But the fact of the matter is I still have a smartphone. I still access the internet from my phone anywhere I want, any time of the day or night. But he talks about, he says, if you have the choice of upgrading a perfectly good phone for another perfectly good phone, or upgrading a perfectly good car for another perfectly good car, and you give them more money for the new phone or for the new car, maybe we have a little bit more than we need. And again, it's not to be guilty about that. It's just to make sure that our heart perspectives are right so that we become grateful for what God's blessed us with and so that He can get that blessing through us to transform the world. We talk about status symbols and personal value. You know, we really have trouble with this because our value is oftentimes tied up in materialism. We often place value on our lives and ourselves based on how well we dress, how nice the car we drive is. Listen, I got to tell you, a couple weeks ago, I had the good fortune of preaching a funeral. And if you've seen my Honda, it's a great Honda. But that thing, it's taken a licking from hail damage. The paint is peeling off of it. One year during the storms, a piece of metal came and scraped the side of it. It's a nice car. I've taken the best care I possibly can of it, but it's been beat to pieces. And I'm sitting here thinking, the preacher lines up right behind the brand new Cadillac limos. And here I am, the preacher, driving this old beat up Honda. I said, I really thought that morning, well, at least I can do is borrow Meredith's car for the day because it's a little bit nicer. And the thought actually crossed my mind of borrowing somebody else's car. So I had a nice car to drive in the funeral procession for all of 10 minutes that nobody would care about seeing me and pay attention to anyway, because that wasn't the point. It wasn't my funeral. It wasn't about me. I mean, how wrong can I be? But I had that thought because that's the nature of our culture and our society. It becomes very easy for us to get these issues. And you know what? We get so tied up in these issues that we forget about the folks down the street. We forget about the next person, what they're going through. We forget about what they don't have. The fact that there are hungry children in our community. We forget about those things, and the devil has a heyday with it because the Christians remain powerless and ineffective in transforming the world. And cops have a big problem with money, if we'll be honest. We do, because we like fast cars and bikes and boats and all the nice stuff. And so that's okay. But sometimes we need to think about our perspective. Are we always clinging to these status symbols and craving more and better and upgrade and new and now and all of those sorts of things? So what is the proper perspective? If you have any more toes, I'm stepping on them now. The proper perspective is not I crave it or I want more. It's I'm content with it. We should have ambitions. We should have desires for success. We should want better. But it all has to be within the proper context, the proper perspective, the proper heart. Listen to what 1 Timothy chapter 6, beginning with verse 6 says. Now godliness with contentment is great gain. Listen, I'm going to tell you something. As I was studying for this, and I'm going to maybe bring this up later on when we talk about marriage and stuff like that. But the Lord spoke to my heart about this and said, if we could learn to be content with our marriages, with the partner we have, and all the problems that I have, if we can learn to be content, God can bless us. God can work in it. But we're always wanting the skinnier, the prettier, the faster, the wiser, the more, the better, the newer, the louder. We always want this moving target. And listen, I used to sell electronics, and guess what? They upgrade before you walk out the store with what you got. So where do we stop it? He says, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it's certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Think about that foolish purchase because you operated off of impulse, and how much trouble it got you into. It may have ended up getting you over your head. Some of you may be dealing with stress of paying credit card bills and all this stuff now because we got over our heads because we were discontent, and so we made frivolous or ambitious purchases, and we got ourselves in trouble. And then this is what he says in verse 10. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. People say money is, money, the Bible doesn't say that money is evil. There's nothing wrong with money. Money answers all things. You got to have money to live. God uses money. He blesses us with money. But if you love money, that is the root of all evil. For which some, get this, some have strayed from the faith into greediness, and pierce themselves through with many sorrows. So what is contentment? The contentment is the ability to say no to yourself. The ability to be satisfied where you are and with what you have. And the ability to recognize that discontentment fuels irresponsible spending. The I crave it perspective leads to disappointment, because the truth of the matter is, we will never get enough. But the I'm content with it perspective leads to joy. Verses 20 and 21, as Kevin and Joey or whichever one's going to come, says the man's life would end that night. The proper perspective should have been to seek a rich relationship with God over earthly riches. And so Andy Stanley says it's not what you have that matters. It's what you do with what you have that will count either for you or against you in the kingdom of heaven. The heart of the matter is that we are blessed, we are called to be good stewards, and we should be content with the blessings that we have in life. Now listen, we're going as we start talking about, getting out of debt. One of the things when we start talking about stopping the bleeding of debt, stop digging the hole deeper, one of the first things you have to do is learn to be content with what you have and say no to yourself. Say no to the next thing, the next upgrade. And if we'll do that, we'll lead to getting ourselves out of debt. And listen, I'm going to brag on this, and it's a prayer thing. But years ago, Meredith and I made the decision. We went through one of these programs and we started working. And listen, we didn't get ourselves into our struggles overnight, and we hadn't gotten out of them overnight. But with the exception of school loans, we're debt free. We don't own a house, but guess what? We'll work on that later, but we're going to make sure that we do it the God way, so that when we do get to the point, and we will get to that point one day, that it will be a blessing for us that serves us for ministry purposes, and not one where all we can do is find the next extra job, the next task, the next way to be stressed about it. Because we got to get our perspectives right. And we're a work in progress, and you're a work in progress, but I am confident that every one of you sitting here tonight can be debt-free. You can be stress-free. You can have confidence in knowing, yes, I'm prepared, I have a savings, I have insurance. Listen, one of the mistakes I made is Meredith got on me and said, we need to get insurance, we need to get life insurance. And she was pregnant, and she starts talking, and I'm like, we're 20-something years old, 28 years old. I get, $50,000 life insurance from the police department, whatever the case, and I was dragging my feet about it. And she kept on and on and on. And I dragged my feet. And then she had a massive heart attack. And if she would have died, I would have been up a creek. But guess what? You think anybody's going to sell us life insurance today for her? She's had a major incident, a major heart incident. Nobody will say. So she's got to live forever, at least until after I die, because I got to die to leave the life insurance so she can die. you know, we need to listen to the promptings of the Holy Spirit and our spouses, and we need to realize you're going to be debt-free. You're going to live stress-free. You're going to be blessed. You're going to have enough, and then you're going to have enough to bless other people. And that's the thing. That's the crazy thing about it. The more you give, the more God gives you. Because you don't give to get, but the more you give, God knows I can trust Him with it, and He'll give it to you to continue to bless people.